Welcome to the ACT Canada Knowledge Mobilization Committee's webinar today. I think many of you have been to our previous webinars in this series. We're grateful to welcome you here. I am one of the co-chairs of the committee along with Justin Presseau, and we're happy to welcome you here today to our webinar series. And in fact, Justin will talk more about this, but this is the concluding event in our little mini webinar series that we started last year. We've covered a number of topics that pertain to knowledge mobilization in randomized trials of all different types. We had some about how patients engage in knowledge mobilization. We had a session about a Canadian consortium, the CanSolve CKD group, and how they are facilitating knowledge mobilization of the trials that their group is conducting. And as we thought about the type of webinar that we wanted to host to kind of end things off, we thought we would take a look at really integrating knowledge mobilization into the design of RCTs. And one way to do that is through adaptive platform trials. And especially as we think broadly, not just to Canadian trials, but also how can we expand and scale the impact that Canadian trialists are able to have globally. An adaptive platform trial at a global scale is really quite an innovative and novel way to do that. And so we're very grateful to have Dr. Bijoy Menon here today to give us a talk about the ACT Global Adaptive Platform Trial. I've known Bijoy for a long time. We were classmates together in grad school, and it's been great to see Bijoy's career really take off as he's built his research program, leading this among many other trials. And so Bijoy is a neurologist and a professor here at the University of Calgary in the Departments of Clinical Neurosciences and Radiology and Community Health Sciences, and he leads a internationally recognized research program on acute stroke care. And I will let Bijoy tell us about his research program and the adaptive platform that they have set up. So Bijoy, we'll pass it over to you, and we'll ask you to save your questions to the end. You can feel free to put them in the chat box, or we will have a Q&A session at the end. But if you want to throw them in the chat box, and we can refer back to them after. But over to you, Bijoy. We're looking forward to what you have to share today.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I'm presuming you guys can hear me now, right? And see the slides. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I was just discussing with Elisa. I'm not sure why I have this background, but it does remind me of, the open ocean is a sense of, the infinite world we live in, right? And then I presume this rig is saying, like how we are in this universe. So we are, often alone, but social beings. I deal with a common disease, but it is a difficult challenge. I deal with stroke. And as many of you know, it is one of the largest global health burdens, increasingly in many of the low and middle income countries. It is the biggest cause for disabilities. And so it is a major problem. Now, my career, over the last 15 to 20 years, from residency to fellowship to now being an attending, has mirrored some of the most, I would say, biggest advances in stroke medicine, from a time when I was a medical student where we could do nothing to now where we have a lot on offer for our stroke patients. It's been that way incredibly gratifying to be a part of that journey. However, if you actually look at the unmet needs, there's still lots to be done, even in the best of places. And I consider Calgary to be maybe I don't like saying this, but maybe the best place for somebody to have a stroke. It is still a fact that almost 50% of our patients don't tend to do well. And so there's a lot of unmet need, and this need is significantly more globally, especially in low and middle income countries. And so we need more innovation and we need more trials, therefore. But we are also at a space in the evolution of stroke care where the type of trials we need to do, because of the absence of what I would call low-hanging fruit type of treatment are now larger trials that actually needs tens of thousands of patients to show these modest treatment effects. And as you all know, each question today, each trial today, there's a possibility that it could actually take very long, 5 to 10 years, and lots of cost and lots of efforts. So that's the context for today's talk. And so if that is the problem that we are facing, if you have a disease state like stroke that is large and with a lot of burden, and the fact that evidence, therefore, has to build, continuously, but at large scale, then the concept of platform trials is not an option. It is just essential. And I hope to convince you over the next many slides that that is the case. Now, here is a conventional model of doing a clinical trial. And so I call it the one question, one protocol, one trialist model. And we all have, participated in such a model, where what we do is we start a trial. So I got to come up with an idea, write a grant, or work with industry, get funding, set up the protocol, set up contracts, set up the data infrastructure and the trial infrastructure, and then work on it. And then once I have completed that work, then most of the soft infrastructure does not exist. The contracts are a result of that trial. And then when I go to the next question, then I have to start this process all over again. Now, when we work as teams, for example, McMaster, us, then I think, working as a team allows us to gain some more efficiency. So I might be doing a trial, my colleague might be doing another trial, and that we could potentially harness some efficiencies in terms of data infrastructure and teams. So that is possible with this model, but still is a fact that with each trial, something dies, and then a new trial comes in and we have to build again. So that's the current model. And so I feel like that model or research system that I call it, elegant as it may be on paper, is still exclusionary in practice and doesn't allow you to actually scale up the concept of doing trials in multiple places, to address the issue of competing trials, to address some of these issues of cost and the logistical and fiscal efficiencies that I'll show you in the next slides. And so this is where the adaptive platform trial comes up as a potential solution. And so what is a platform trial? Now, the concept started coming up, I think, in the early 2010s, and primarily started off in oncology, where you had the concept of a basket trial, where you would have these multiple disease states in cancer, and then you may have a common targeted intervention. And the question was, now have a common targeted intervention, a drug potentially that could work across these different cancer states. Why may I not try and do something more efficient where I actually test the drug across these multiple disease states? So there's some efficiency gained with a basket trial concept, and I'll show you, basket trial that we're trying to do in the next slides. Then there's this concept of an umbrella trial. And what is that? Again, from oncology, where it's a single disease state now, and you may have multiple interventions that might actually work in that disease state. So why not consider doing a trial that actually tests these multiple interventions against what possibly is standard of care, but also at the same time have, let's say, a common control or common standard of care, and then gain statistical efficiencies. So now instead of having, 3 different controls for each of these interventions, I have a common control. And so that's the umbrella trial. And then, it's very easy for you to think of, combining these two, but then going one step further. And that is the concept of a platform trial, where I might actually think that I have, multiple interventions to compare to a standard arm. But then why not think of, what happens if, let's say, intervention one turns out to be, maybe working or maybe not working, and I drop that. But then I continue with this other intervention. But then something new has happened, and there's a new drug, and I can add this in an iterative manner. And then maybe I see that intervention three is now working, and now it becomes my standard of care. And so that becomes standard of care. I add intervention four, and you see how you could potentially think of these issues from that perspective. For the purists, with the old model, you may say, but what's the statistics around it? What are the biases? How do you compare past to the future? And so those are, questions that you do need to address. But if you can methodologically address those questions, then you have what is a platform trial. But as you can see, there are some advantages there. The platform trial now becomes a single trial of trials that is perpetually run. It does allow you to address multiple research questions simultaneously across one disease state, and possibly, disease states across what I call a basket condition. It allows you to use same contracts and infrastructure. And then the very idea that you don't have to stop and start, but you could have, future questions come in seamlessly plugged in. Now, I do need to underline the word seamlessly, but that's the idea, seamlessly plugged in, and then continue further using the same infrastructure. So that's the concept of a platform trial. Now, as is the norm with us humans, when we face a challenge is when innovation tends to happen, right? And so oncology, was starting to develop the concept of, these what I would call supra-efficient trials, the umbrella basket and the platform. But then adoption across other fields was still less. I think, internal medicine and cardiology were slowly looking at those ideas. But then COVID happened, right? Like in 2020. And what is the problem that COVID posed us? The problem it posed us was that we had to understand the effect of multiple potential interventions in a disease state like COVID, but we didn't have the luxury of time. There was this pressure, and in some ways, if I go back to my own recollection of the year 2020, there was even an existential question, right? Like with COVID. And so that challenging time does result in innovation, and we start seeing things from a completely different perspective. And so there was this pressure on us to actually show that different interventions possibly work, or, as you know from the politics of those times, possibly do not work. We wanted to do it fast, and we wanted to do it more efficiently. And so one of the, I would say, program of innovation then, with a platform trial was REMAP-CAP. And there were other platform trials, including, the Solidarity trial, I think there was Recovery, that was the UK-led platform. But REMAP-CAP was one of those platforms that came out from the COVID era. And so what did it do? So this is how it set itself up. You had patients with suspected or proven COVID, with, let's say, a severe state COVID and a moderate state COVID. And then you had these questions that we call domains. Question one, question two, it could be maybe, as an example, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, potentially steroid. That, we're being asked in the severe disease state, possibly also in the moderate disease state, and you could even think of, let's say, mild disease state, so non-hospital patients. And then you were addressing these questions where you could add these interventions as questions. You could add, states itself. So, I did mention states. Patients were randomized to X, Y, possibly, could be one intervention, it could be multiple. Patients could progress across states, so that was also interesting. And then you had a primary outcome that was fairly standard to begin with, right? And so that was REMAP-CAP. The methodology around that was set up in consultation with methodologists, many of whom had a Bayesian background. But as I will tell you in the next few slides, Bayesian and platforms do not need to go together. But that was the setup of REMAP-CAP. So it was able to answer multiple questions simultaneously and at pace, and therefore able to scale up both in time as well as in numbers. There's this other element of the platform trial concept that we call the adaptive platform trial. So the adaptive platform trial has the platform concept and the adaptive concept. The adaptive design. And so this is again something, like I, as a methodologist, have always appreciated and wanted to do more of, which is that as we accrue data, why is it that we don't try and learn more from that data? And when I was, as was Dave, doing our grad school together, there's always this idea from a frequentist perspective that the more you look at the data, that, there's this likelihood of alpha spending, and therefore there's a cost. However, there's the mathematical cost, but there was the psychological, or I would say the prevailing belief that therefore try and look at the data less. And there was always this tension within me about, looking at the data and learning, which was, like something quite obvious, and then the trade-off in terms of cost, right? Until I was exposed to some of these other designs that look at this trade-off in what I would call a more thoughtful manner. And so just this concept of adaptation to actually learn more, and I'm using the word continuous, it is possible, and there are now trials that actually do this. But more frequently was another innovation in terms of, adding to the platform design. And as I showed you that platform trial design from COVID, not from COVID-2, from REMAP-CAP, but also from oncology, adaptation then becomes an inherent need for a platform because it allows you to continuously learn. And that is, like how you could add, different interventions, move on from one intervention to the other. And therefore, adaptation becomes a structural need, in my opinion. And so what is the adaptive process? Put it in simple terms, it is exactly this. Data comes in, you're analyzing the available data. Pre-hoc or a priori, you have, rules. I'm calling these stopping rules, but they need not be stopping rules. They could actually be even, like adaptations on allocations. There are multiple things that you could do. And then depending on how you meet or do not meet those rules, you adapt, you revise allocation, you revise, like even, like sample size. But then you are continuously collecting data further. So it becomes a learning system or a learning continuum. So that's the adaptive process. Now, some of the adaptive processes that I have found very useful and that we have then modeled and incorporated in our global include, these things: frequent interim analysis for efficacy, futility, harm with explicit decision rules for stopping an arm, for enrichment, which is, stopping a subgroup, or expansion indications, which is where adding a subgroup might also be done. Information borrowing across domains. I've always felt that, even if you have to say subpopulations, that if an intervention is being tested in one subpopulation, I do think, like there is some learning to be had about its effect in that population, and that we could potentially apply it in the other population. And so it's not like, these are completely exclusionary, but you have to be thoughtful about this. There's, dose response modeling, quite useful, both in early phase studies, and even I'm increasingly of the opinion that, we do need to consider some of these strategies in later phases. I mentioned enrichment design, super important when we want to narrow down to where target might lie. Response-adaptive randomization, I feel, has ethical implications depending on the questions that you may choose, but there are certain sort of constructs where response-adaptive randomization works. And so we have used all of these strategies, not in all trials, but across different trials. It's like, where do these fit in appropriately to what questions? And we, have tried to use them across the different trials that we have in the platform. So therefore, what is, a adaptive platform trial of the nature that we have, which is the global adaptive platform trial? The paradigm is that we wanted to, as I said, move away from the whole system of repetition to reuse. And, this comes from my own, background in physics and math. Like, I just like this idea of reusing things. And so what are we reusing? We're reusing master contracts. I use the word reuse, but take it in that way. Master contracts. So the legal infrastructure is something that is efficiently done. There are ethics templates that we share across, and that there's a shared data architecture. The adaptive design allows learning while execution or running. And then domains start plugging in, results emerge faster. And then there's also this, what I call network effect, which is where infrastructure compounds, and I'll show you what that means. And so when we do all of these, what it does for our platform that is focused on stroke research is that it actually turns our platform into, from a series of what I would call discrete experiments into a living learning system. And so that is what an adaptive platform trial is, and that is what ACT Global is. It is designed by intent, right? There are also these hidden efficiencies. I mentioned some things about governance, but I also wanted to show you something about fiscal efficiencies and then data efficiencies. And so governance, as I mentioned, we do have master contracts, everything that we do on the ethical framework side, there are commonalities across the platform, use same principles. The packages that we have are reusable. So when a new domain comes in, they just have to adapt a little bit, but most things stay the same. With the data itself, and I'll show you in another slide, we have built a standalone bottom-up system, both software, data, EDC, metadata, monitoring, which is standard and the same across all the trials. And that is immensely helpful for the boots on the ground, where they do not have to jump across systems. Processes are the same. And therefore, the cognitive burden that I sort of is the word I use for coordinators or for investigators on the ground is significantly reduced, while the work that we do centrally becomes far easier. There are, these fiscal efficiencies, and I would, have a different slide that I'll actually show you. But centrally, there's a lot of sharing of budget, but there's also efficiencies to be gained at the site level, both in terms of co-enrollment, in terms of reduced cost to operations, faster activations, and also, as I'll show you when we build global networks, in terms of what I call moving away from this sort of zero-sum budgeting, right? And so there are fiscal efficiencies to be gained. And then, the logistical efficiencies, as I mentioned, tie into some of these above with common monitoring systems, with electronic consents, prompts, and others. But what does all of this mean? From a functional perspective, what it means is that, we are building a framework, right? Like we're building these frameworks. And why are frameworks important? Because I have always felt that frameworks are what are sustainable, that frameworks tie into longer term thinking, that people can leave. Our world is, like stochastic, random. Lots of things happen. People can leave, but frameworks generally tend to stay. And so if you can focus on building frameworks, they not just gain efficiencies in terms of reducing delay, increasing equity, helping focus on the science, they actually create a more sustainable system. And so this is, from a value-based perspective, why the platform helps when compared to the older model. There's also this idea that that frameworks create flywheels, and that's the network effect. And what do I mean by that? So I'm not sure whether, like many of you have heard of, you must have, but, so there's you may have, there's an investing firm called Nomad, and they came up with this term called scaled economy shared, right? And this is a term in economics, but it applies to companies like Walmart or Costco. And what is that? It is, like scaling up an infrastructure to actually then give advantage to the customer that then helps them scale things up further. And so with each thing that they do, they share with the customer the marginal, the margins are on the lower side. They share the benefits with the customers. And then that sort of increasingly allows them to scale up. That creates their moat. And that then allows them to grow further. And so I do think, the concept of an adaptive platform, if done right, each new domain, because of the ease of execution, then helps, build the network or grow the network. Sites then gain capacity. That then helps them start the next domain faster. That then helps with future trials. The common training, audit, and data processes that we have reduce friction. And that is the flywheel effect. And so the more we use the platform, the more efficient it becomes, the more equitable it becomes, and the more easier it then becomes to scale up. This is fiscal efficiency, and I do have an entire presentation on this issue that I quite like looking into. But just conventionally, from a simple perspective, if you run a trial, it has its own cost, a second trial has its own cost, a third trial has its own cost. The question is, in the margins or the border zones, there are a lot of inefficiencies, and can we harness those inefficiencies, both at a site level, but I think increasingly when we run global trials, there's an advantage in terms of what I call moving away from zero-sum budgeting, because of some of these restrictions that different jurisdictions put on where grant money can flow and how it can flow, that there are ways to harness fiscal efficiencies using the adaptive platform that allows you to run multiple trials more efficiently. I also wanted to stress on the fact that, although I have a lot of interest in operations and methods, there's a reason why I do many of these things. For me, the values or the reason why I do these things do matter a lot. And although, for all of you today attending this talk, you may be methodologists and you may be more interested in the science, I do think, I feel like, thinking about why we do what we do is really important. And so some of those elements of the way I have thought about this question do reflect in the design of ACT Global. And so I call ACT Global a values-based platform. And what does that mean? So a key value for us is pragmatism. This is William James, and how, that term came about, pragmatism, which is, so simple, right? Like a proposition is true if it works satisfactorily, and unpractical ideas do get rejected. And so I did mention, the frameworks, but I must tell you, intellectually, though, I sort of, have always tried to run away from, intellectual frameworks, right? Or as I call it, CAMs. And so for me, an idea that works is the idea that we should sort of, go ahead and pursue. And so this is something that we have been quite focused on that we have built or want to build things that are fit for purpose, right? So each trial or each question may have, a certain element that we may need to accommodate or change to fit that question. And so we build designs that are fit for purpose. We don't use existing frameworks and then our existing, what I would call belief systems, and then try and mold the question to the belief systems. We do it the other way around. There's also the EDC system that this is something I've been super cognizant of for many years, is that I do want research to be embedded in practice, that I acknowledge that many of my colleagues, have their lives to lead, that they have their clinical practice, and that is more important to them. And unlike me, where I have this luxury of, protected time as a researcher, they don't have that. And so it is really important that we do things to actually allow the conduct of research to be embedded in clinical care. And so all that we do, the type of questions we ask, the systems we build, the EDC system, the randomizer, the way we collect outcomes, are all primed towards ease of use for the investigator and for the coordinator. And then we design budgets that we think are win-win for both sites and for trials. And what does that mean? So we do interact with people. We do sort of ask questions at the ground. We focus on understanding where costs go, and then we allocate appropriately. So in some ways, it's an exercise in capital allocation too. But, we do focus a lot to make sure that it is still a win-win, right? Like for both sites and for us centrally. And so here's one example of the focus on pragmatism where, for our platform, we don't focus on just sort of explanatory trials. Our trials range across the spectrum. Some are super pragmatic, but some are explanatory. Some are industry driven, but some are, purely academic, investigator initiated. Some are a hybrid. And so we do that on purpose, right? Design trials that are fit for purpose. As I told you, like in terms of capital allocation, I do feel strongly that technology helps drive scale. And so we, unlike other trials, do invest heavily in building technology. And note that I use the word build because the idea is that the technology that we build then allows us to use the same for the next trial. And so many things that we have built here, the randomizer, super fast, easy to access, multimedia, electronic consents, remote risk-based monitoring. We're trying to layer ML and AI-based approaches to automate as many of these processes as possible, create risk-based monitoring paradigms, create a system where our coordinators and monitors can actually interact with the system to such that things become more efficient. We work to enable fast throughput data flow and linkages for analysis. I mentioned machine learning and now increasingly AI-enabled quality controls. We do want to work on EPROMs. The dream for me is to do a trial where every outcome, is collected from patients electronically or remotely, and that we have to do nothing else. That's a dream, but hopefully, we'll achieve that at some point in time in the future. And we want to also make things easier for every one of these things. We want to build using VMS, so vertically managed software, right? So build it so that everything is single point access. So this is again our value. So this is why I say, why are we doing this? Because we want to build ACT Global for busy clinicians, not for full-time researchers. And that is a key value system. I've also increasingly felt that research drives care, that if research is well done, that it simply increases the quality of care offered in hospitals. And this is why equity is important. There's a reason why, we do need all types of patients across smaller, more rural hospitals in Canada, middle and low-income countries, all of them to be capable of participating in research. And so some of the things that I showed you that we do, from the type of questions we ask, the technology we enable, the culture that we create is all focused on reducing these inequities. And when you reduce these inequities, you have more data that flows in from all these underrepresented groups that then creates more robust evidence. And so in some ways, this is an exercise in better science. And so that is what ACT Global is. It's a system that belongs to everyone. It is creating a template, at least in the stroke space, for us and for our collaborators, for a global collaboration. So our goal has been to have the platform running across 400 hospitals globally. And then we want to do it learning from RemapCap. I'm not sure whether some of you know Monish Pabrai. So he says, the best thing that you can do is to actually try and copy somebody to learn from the best. And so RemapCap has done this. So we feel, why can't we? And so the idea is that, we try and set up all these global nodes across the world so that these nodes then have, sites within them. So these are what we call RCCs, or regional coordinating centers. And we want, because we think representation matters, so as you can see, by deliberate intent, we are moving to all these continents and then exploring beyond. Now, I did want to tell you something else, right? Like, because you are a value-based platform, that I do think that building people and partnerships are the most important thing that you could do when you build platforms. So, and this can only be built brick by brick by building trust. And so we do have partners, as I told you, across the globe. And then locally, I work at the University of Calgary with the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. But we work with patient support groups. We work with the industry. We work with, multiple funders, regulators. We work with statistical groups like Berry. We have a key partner, which is the George Institute in Sydney. We're working closely with UCD and now with other nodes across the world. And the hope is that these nodes are all able to do their own trials within the platform. Now, no platform succeeds without, people who believe in it. And in the early days of ACT Global, some 3 or 4 years ago, when it was just an idea, we do, have people who believed in it and people who were, skeptics. But this is the way it is, this is how things happen, right? And why am I putting this slide here? This is for the younger people in the audience. I just wanted to say that, you just need to push through, right? But you need to be clear about what your values are. So when you interact with other partners, it's quite easy to actually erode values and then, the structure suffers, right? And then you need to continuously learn. And so the way you can do this is by being transparent with your partners, by trying to see whether you could create a culture of shared ownership and not just authorships, and then recognize that equity across sites and countries does make the platform stronger. I just wanted to show you, some of the trials we're doing as examples within the platform. So ACT-WEN is a umbrella trial. So you see, within the platform itself, we now have an umbrella trial that is asking 3 different questions. It is asking this dose question about thrombolysis, which is where people who are at higher risk in the spectrum, would they benefit from a lower dose or connected plays? Again, learning from cardiology, where Stream 2 tried to answer this question. And then we have within the same umbrella, ACT-WEN, can we thrombolize patients on DOACs? And if we do, and this is increasingly becoming a problem in stroke, with more and more patients on DOACs, what dose should we treat them with? And then for patients who go EVT, should we actually bridge when they have emergent EVT available? And if you're bridging, then what should we do? And so this whole concept, designed as a complete pragmatic, heavily pragmatic trial, is trying to build, the evidentiary framework for when we have moved on to tenecteplase in acute stroke. And so that's when we have Enchanted, which is where we are trying to understand what to do with blood pressure management post-endovascular thrombectomy. As you can see, these are some of the larger trials in the acute stroke space, just purely in terms of numbers. And so this domain is trying to answer that question conclusively. We have REACT, which is post-endovascular treatment, thrombolysis for a partial reflow or no reflow phenomena. This is a crucial question in modern thrombectomy practice, and we are trying to design REACT to be to answer this question globally and in a robust manner. There have been multiple small trials, but they are we still don't have a large trial that actually addresses this question. And so those are some examples of the type of questions we're asking. So there's ACT When, so 3 questions in it, ACT Enchanted, there's REACT, there's the neuroprotection with the new PSD95 inhibitor mimicking the NINDS trial. So super early patients within 3 to 4.5 hours, whether this neuroprotection drug works. There is so these are all in acute ischemic stroke. ICH is a different state, intracerebral hemorrhage. So you're asking this question whether colchicine and desferrioxamine works in that condition. We are working on Activate, which is in the neuro recovery space, the new drug. There is Coprime, which is, my young colleague, Mahesh, trying to understand what is the optimal antithrombotic strategy post-acute reperfusion, so a gap in evidence. There is Impact, which is in the planning stages right now, trying to understand what we do in medium vessel occlusions post, some of the more recent trials. ACT is thrombolysis, balance of blood pressure management around thrombolysis acutely. Lotus still in the works. We're trying to understand blood pressure management. There is a different trial in a low and middle income country where we are focused on antithrombotic and blood pressure management in the stroke unit phase. And there are multiple other trials or questions in the planning stages with various collaborators. All of these trials, some of them are Bayesian in structure, some are frequentist, some are hybrid. Some are explanatory, some are on the pragmatic spectrum, some are concomitant randomizations, some are sequential randomizations. And so we have methodologies across these different conditions and states. So what are the updates? We are now enrolling in, so we started enrolling about, I think, October, so November, so 16 months ago. So we now have Canada active, coast to coast, Australia, China, New Zealand, South Korea. Then across all these different countries, we are at various stages of contracts and startup. This slide, I don't know why the number, oh yeah, here. So we are 1,800 subjects over those 14 months across all these different trials. So rapidly enrolling and scaling up. And so that is where global is. So as I was telling you, these platform trials are partnerships, right? So they allow faster startup. I must tell you, faster startup doesn't work for the platform itself. It is a longer runway when compared to a conventional trial. But once you set it up, then the next ones become faster. So that requires a lot of patience, but we have never had lots of patience. So common data standards, governance, transparency, pre-specified decision rules, global reach, and credibility. And so what is a platform? It is essentially a consortium partnership. And so I look at this as not a single trial. It's a framework, as I said, to run, common, how we should focus on a common disease condition like stroke. And by addressing all these various pain points, we make, global science in whatever disease state we choose, faster, fairer, and more inclusive. As I told you, I've always, tried to learn from, and I come from Kerala, which is in the south of India. So when I was growing up, I grew up in a very sort of what I would call a traditional family. And the Upanishads were part of my growing up, as was the Gita. And so here's a quote from the Upanishad: as is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. And so how do you apply that to your life, and to what you do? So designing a trial is just like building a life brick by brick, requiring intentional design, requiring respect for process and deep attention to people. So I will stop here. I do have to say my thanks to all my colleagues, some that I may have missed here, and then thanks to my family. Thank you.
Joy, thank you so very much for that fantastic overview, really inspiring overview of what's really possible with adaptive platform trials, really the promise of all the economies of scale and efficiencies, and in a lot of ways is contributing to the A of accelerating clinical trials, right? In many ways, and really towards the end, the global scale and potential for impact is just phenomenal. So thank you for your expertise in walking us through that. Maybe I'll open up for questions. I've got some of my own, but let's open it up to anyone in the chat, or just raise your hand. We'll go to you. Maybe I can get us going potentially. I mean, one thing that really struck me, you've got really lots of nice thoughts throughout, and I really loved your build on frameworks, not heroes perspective. And if I had to take that one with due credit, that's a really nice way to think about how do you do this in a way that built a legacy of activity that doesn't rely on any one person. That's great. I guess my question was coming at this from one of my questions anyway, is coming at this from a knowledge mobilization perspective. You talk a lot about learning, the learning potential of platform trials, and from your perspective, who's doing the learning over time?
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Good question. So as a trialist, I do want to learn and learn fast, right? Like, and learn continuously. And so at the foundational level, the trialist learns fast, right? But as you see, like in the trials we design, I did tell you about us sort of involving coordinators and patients, and so that learning about the interventions, the trialists do. But as that learning happens, with the systems itself, with what we build, I think, the trial infrastructure, our coordinators and whoever is involved in trial management, they learn about what's possible. I think what became quite clear in our patient focus groups is that, the way they think about this is that, the primary thing that patients are concerned about when we do clinical trials, and we have had these focus groups where we have asked them about deferred consent, about emergency consents. What has struck me always is that that the primary reason why they support us doing some of these studies is this issue of trust, right? So the patient investigator trust is super important. And so many of these trials, because we do these trials in the acute stroke space, at least in the Canadian context and Australian context, run by deferred consent or emergency consents. So trust becomes super important, right? And so we have been able to do this across these trials. But why am I mentioning that? I'm mentioning that because imagine a situation where trials happening, an intervention is potentially succeeding, hypothetically, in the black box, and you tell your patient, I will not look at that information because of these sort of methodological reasons, right? And if you present it to the patient from that perspective, the patient would say, that's a problem, right? And so the continuous learning for me is also a way of building trust, right? It is a way of building trust. And so I feel like, when you ask me this question of who's learning, I learn, but I learn incrementally because I want to convey that learning to my patients and modify whatever I'm doing, right? I want to be able to stop something early if it doesn't work. I shouldn't be caring about, I cannot stop and I shouldn't stop, because if I stop, then what would the reviewer say? And then maybe I wouldn't have a publication. Or, like, I just want to be able to stop if it is at some point the right reason to stop. And what is the right reason? That right reason, depending on the type of question, may actually, from a scientific perspective, let's say I have a threshold for a high risk intervention where I would say I should stop, even if, like, there is only, a X% probability that you are right? But if it is a incrementally, if it is a question that has significant importance from a health utility perspective for that patient, I should be able to take that risk, right? And so this is, again, a learning system. And so this is why I feel, like everybody learns when, you use that approach, right? So, and then I feel like that continuous learning, fundamental reason why we do this is it builds trust.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And I wasn't expecting to go that direction, but it's such a nice way to frame it. And I wondered where I thought you might go, and I wondered your thoughts on is there's this whole other concept in the implementation improvement science space around learning health systems. And I feel like there's this really interesting, but maybe underexplored, or maybe it's me that just hasn't explored it enough, potential interface between the thought processes and the efficiencies and the learning ethos of platform trials as being the kind of rigorous backbone of a learning health system. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that too, right? And I think, when we were working on a different grant more recently with, and Dave was providing his inputs, there's that aspect, right, of a platform where, I showed you some interventions that are what I would call classic interventions, but they are what I would call, interventions, for example, because I'm a stroke researcher in the stroke unit space, interventions that we may do at a systems level, interventions that may be for what I would call task shifting. So all of these things you could actually embed within a platform that then allows continuous learning, and that then allows, a change in systems of care too, right? And so at a certain level, I think these actually become a spectrum, right? Where, you are learning, the evidence is building and it is continuously translating, right? And so as you scale up, so I don't see knowledge translation, we have this normal frame. This is why the PASS framework is a evidence. You create evidence and then in a serial manner, you go there. But I think, as you were mentioning, right, it's a continuous learning health system. So
fabulous. Yep. Double check on, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, Bijoy, amazing presentation. Thank you for that. One thing that I'm especially inspired by is the fact that you said that, this kind of started, you said at the early days of ACT Global. I was expecting you to say 15 years ago, but you said 3 or 4 years, and then you told us about 15 trials that you have ongoing. So I think that's really impressive in terms of the ability to crank out new trials and then study new topics once you have the infrastructure in place. And I think you talked a lot about that, about the kind of the benefits that come to someone, but I guess maybe could you talk about some of the challenges about especially working globally across contexts and kind of when you're setting these things up, is it challenging when you have these kind of common processes working in such different contexts? I think about some of the small rural hospitals in Nigeria and then, big hospitals in Toronto or New York, and trying to have standardized processes in such diverse places.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. So, we all know about the, the innovation curve, right? Like where you have these super early innovators, super early adopters, and then, and I've always felt that, most of us on average are very comfortable with the status quo, that we hate change, right? And that is a common theme that runs across. And so when we're doing these platforms, although, I showed you the example of RemapCap, which, has been incredibly successful, and other platforms during COVID, again, in the stroke space, so that's a siloed space, right? Like people are not much aware of platforms. And then the concept of, that we could do these things, that we could ask multiple questions, that you could co-enroll patients into multiple interventions, that you may have master. All of these things are new, right? And so the biggest challenge has been trying to do what I did today, right? Convey these ideas and hope that people understand and buy into these. And when I say people, it's not just, the investigator, then you have to convince the regulator. And in most of these, when you do these trials globally, sometimes the regulator and then there's the ministry. And then there are, groups. And so this is why I said, the runway initially in setting it up is it takes a lot of time, right? But if you have, a long-term view on these things, that's always an investment, right? Say good investment of your time. And so, Dave, I think the biggest challenges has actually been trying to move the needle in terms of people's understanding of the utility of the concept. And not just in terms of methodology, but also in terms of all the other things that I told you, right? I was recently at a NIH presentation on platform trials, and this is again a point that I wanted to make, right? In any field, right? Like when people initially start, that you do not have these ideas, and that you're sort of creating these ideas that then create what a something new is. But now after a certain period of time, then people start coming in who now want to define what an adaptive platform trial is. And so now you'll start seeing these papers come in where people say, this is an adaptive platform trial, and this is not an adaptive platform trial. This is what it is. And that also is a challenge where people sometimes say, oh, you got to do it this way. Then why are you calling it this? And I don't want to get stuck in those debates, right? Which is why I say, what we do is design things for fit for purpose. And so there are those two things, right? One is where something new, and then there's a challenge in terms of what people can, and then there is people who think, now this is what it is supposed to be, and therefore, create challenges. So.
Great. Thanks for that, Vijay.
Well, tremendous. I think we're pushing up against the top of the hour. So I think it just leaves me to thank you again, Bijoy, for taking the time out of your day to present this to us in ACT. And then for everybody on the line, as Dave mentioned, this is our last webinar in our planned Knowledge Mobilization ACT webinar series. But if you want to go back and kind of look at all the hits, I'm just putting in the chat where you can access previously recorded webinars in case you didn't get a chance to see any of the previous ones. But besides that, on behalf of Dave and I and the whole ACT committee, ACT-KM committee, thanks for joining us across these webinars and today in particular, and just wishing you all the best going forward. Thanks very much, everyone.